Hello, everyone. I wanted to just say some things about the second set of Phaedo study questions. Teaching the Phaedo is difficult, reading it is difficult, and I think reading it in an online course is especially difficult. Um, just because sometimes I think in reading a difficult philosophical text, especially a difficult Platonic dialogue, it helps to be in the same room together and to do some reading together of the text, uh, which we can't really do online. Um, the second part of Plato's Phaedo is especially challenging. Um, so I didn't try to give you detailed reviews of all the arguments. And some of the arguments, I think, frankly, are ones that I think I understand, but I wouldn't say I have a full grasp of, especially the last argument that Plato gives or Socrates gives for the immortality of the soul. I do refer to it in question 3 there, but I think that it's quite a difficult one, and frankly would take more time for us to go through to get a more thorough understanding of it. So I did my best. One of the things I didn't hit on is the last part of the dialogue, where Plato, or excuse me, Socrates, after all of the arguments, after all of the enormous effort that he gives to try to, well, it depends on how you want to characterize it. Either he's trying to prove the immortality of the soul, or he's at least trying to make the idea plausible, and more plausible than the idea that the soul dies along with the body. It really depends on what you think that overall Socrates is trying to do in this dialogue. It's quite a rich dialogue, and how we ultimately think of what Plato's intentions were in writing it, I think, are up for interpretation. But that last part of it, where after this enormous effort, Socrates just sort of goes off, man, and he tells this incredible myth about what happens to us after we die, and I mean, it's all really kind of crazy. I didn't even go into that because it would have been too much. And then, of course, the scene at the end where he actually drinks the hemlock and dies is actually quite dramatic. But we're focusing more on the central question. One of the things that I've said about the Phaedo is that it is this great work of literature, and it can be read as a piece of literature, and as a quite beautiful and dramatic portrayal of this extraordinary, unique man, Socrates, on the last day of his life, and how he spends his last hours in tremendous, dramatic context of arguing about the immortality of the soul in the hours and up to the minutes before Socrates actually dies. So it's emotionally charged. But when it comes down to it, it's actually quite a specific and philosophical question, whether the soul is immortal and whether the soul can exist without the body. And that is ultimately how we judge the success or failure of the dialogue, is how well Plato, through Socrates, actually argues for the idea that the soul is immortal, that the soul can exist without the body, and that, death is not the end. Death is a transition, unlike in Epicurus, a transition to another state. How well he does that. And the questions are meant to focus us, generally speaking, on that question. Number one, what are the two objections to the immortality of the soul that Socrates must meet in the second half of the Phaedo? These two objections that come in the middle of the dialogue from Simmias and Cebes. Stated briefly, Simmias's objection is that, and I think the whole thrust of his soul as harmony idea is, the objection is that while the soul may be something distinct from the body, it is entirely dependent upon the body. While the soul, and here again, I'm encouraging us to think of soul as a rather wide idea that would encompass things like consciousness, intellect, um, the mental, the the simius idea is that, well, the mental is different from the physical. Our minds are distinct from the body, and the soul is something distinct from the body, and the soul is immaterial. Mind, consciousness are immaterial, but it seems, by all accounts, in terms of our actual experience, that what we call mind always accompanies a functioning body. I mean, none of us have ever actually had an experience, whether it's our own consciousness or what we infer to be the consciousness of others, which of course we can't see or we can't experience directly. We've always seen them in conjunction with a living body. And obviously, if death is a separation, then we have no evidence that the mind or soul can exist or does exist apart from the body. It doesn't mean that it can. It just means that we've never actually observed such a thing. So that first objection, that the soul is like a harmony produced by the body, and therefore that the soul is utterly dependent upon the body for its existence, is a very deep challenge to Socrates' ideas about immortality, because it would imply directly that the soul disappears along with the death of the body. The other objection from Siebes is that even though the soul is something distinct from the body, and even if it can separate from the body, we have no reason to think that it too doesn't eventually go out of existence. I don't really see it as the more important objection. I think Plato did, actually, because he certainly spent more time in the dialogue trying to refute it. But the general idea is that the soul may be something that can exist independently from the body, but does that actually mean that the soul lasts forever? So obviously, if the soul doesn't last forever, then it's not immortal, and it would undercut Plato's ideas. Number two, how does Socrates try to undermine Simmius's idea that the relation of soul to body is actually like the relation of harmony to lyre? That's an argument we have to, you have to look at. There's not one specific point that he raises that undermines this idea, but I think the most important one is that if we think about the sound that a musical instrument makes, that sound is entirely dependent upon the physical instrument. That is, that if you pluck a certain string on a guitar, you will get a certain note. If you hold down a certain number of keys in a particular way on a saxophone, you will get a certain tone. So that the sound or the harmony that a physical instrument makes is completely a function of the state of the physical instrument itself. This is not obviously true in the case of soul and body. That is, the state of the body does not always determine the state of the mind or soul. It does to some extent, I would say. If you have a toothache, if you have an inflamed nerve in your tooth, that is a physical state of your body, and your mental state will more or less be a reflection of it. But that's not totally true. And he gives a case of things like the desires. If the state of the body is hunger, it doesn't necessarily mean that the soul will direct us to eat. We may, for reasons of our own, say no to those desires. And I think that's a very important point in saying that the relationship between the harmony and the lyre is not exactly like this relationship between soul and body, because soul does seem to have independence. Um, it's called self-control. It's called willpower, where the soul can say no to the urgings of the body, which would seem to maybe undercut the whole idea of soul as harmony. Number three, very difficult question. Socrates has a conception of the soul such that death can't apply to it. How? Well, that is his last argument that he gives for the immortality of the soul, and it's quite difficult. It has to mentions the number three and oddness, and how whenever we have the number three, it brings along oddness, and there would never be the presence of three without oddness, and the loose kind of analogy there with soul. Whenever we have soul, let's say an individual living soul, and living soul is a redundancy, right? All souls are living. That's kind of the point. That whenever we have soul, we have life. The essence of soul is life. So that just as if we have a number three, we always have oddness, and we would never have three and evenness together. Whenever we have soul, we have life, and we would never have soul and death together. I'm highly simplifying that argument, partly because of teaching purposes, partly because I myself maybe need to look at it again. But I don't think I'm mischaracterizing it there. And one of the things, at least in terms of getting the idea that I do in the videos, I hope, is refer to one of my favorite classic texts, the Bhagavad Gita from the Hindu tradition, just for clarification purposes, where you have this God, Krishna, who's trying to explain to this human being why killing and dying in battle is not such a big thing, because he says, you're making a mistake because you're thinking of these human beings as consisting totally of their bodies, which can be killed. But you're forgetting that they are not essentially their bodies. They are essentially their souls or selves, whatever you want to call it. But what they essentially are is something immaterial, something non-physical, something spiritual. And that thing is an eternal thing that has no beginning and can have no end. So the point is that it's not the kind of thing that can die. And I think that that's, generally speaking, the conception of soul that Socrates is trying to build in the latter part of this dialogue. That is, that when we think of the word death, we're thinking of things that are born and come to an end, that are born, that grow, that change, and that finally decline and perish. And that's a perfectly accurate way of thinking of physical things, especially physical organisms, living things. But it would be a complete mistake to apply that to non-physical things. For instance, concepts like number or the absolutes or forms that Socrates discusses. The Pythagorean theorem can't die. It was never born. It's not that sort of thing. It's like an eternal truth. And to apply death to it is just absurd. It's not that it's wrong, like saying, oh, the Pythagorean theorem will never die. It's more like saying applying death to Pythagorean theorem just doesn't make any sense. You're applying a category that does apply in some areas and to some things, to something, into another area, into another type of thing to which it doesn't apply. And he's trying to argue that the soul is one of those things. That it would make about as much sense to say that the soul died as to say that the number three became even. Now, I may be stretching a little bit, but I think that that's not too bad in terms of interpretation of the kind of thing that Socrates is doing in the latter part of this dialogue.